Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 3 video. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and hit play on our PowerPoint slides. So just as a reminder, since there wasn't a week 2 video virtual lecture, you can always tell the difference between the PowerPoint slides because you'll see that it says virtual here instead of in person. So, this week we're focusing on culture as well as society and social interactions. But I'm also going to backtrack a little bit to week 2 for the virtual lecture because oftentimes our unit on research methodology takes a little bit longer. And so that was true for our class this semester as well. This week in our virtual lecture, I'm going to do announcements, review, lecture, exit pass, and reminders. Sort of thinking about upcoming attractions at the end of this week, your week 3 weekly assignment is due. It's your first reading quiz. And so we'll cover some of the logistical aspects of that assignment in our in person class, week 3. And then the expectation is that you'll complete that assignment outside of class on your own time. That reading quiz is due Sunday at 11:59 p.m., February 1st. Come prepared for our in-person class to ask any final questions related to completing the pretest, submitting your class signed agreement on eLearn, or any other assignments you might be struggling with, including our week 2 assignment where you had to do a research method related assignment. If you missed our in-person class for week 2, where we went over the week 2 assignment about research methods in depth, it is very likely you will need to meet with me during my office hours to learn more about what you missed because, like I said, I did a tutorial and I showed you how to find scholarly journal articles and how to format and complete that assignment. So if you're struggling with that, you weren't here, and you want to submit it for partial credit, email me, come to my office hours. If you can't make my office hours, I'm happy to schedule a one-on-one interview for another day and time. And I'm also sort of spending this week asking if anyone has any final questions about the course schedule, the syllabus, our eLearn page, or any other logistical aspects of our class. So I know students have added the class, dropped the class, rearranged their semester schedule around. So if you're sort of joining us late or you haven't had the opportunity to ask questions about our class because you've been feeling overwhelmed, this is sort of your last chance to ask questions before the sort of beginning of a new semester time of year is over. And then finally, come prepared for our in-person class to ask any questions or offer any comments or things you want to share with your classmate on Thursday evening. For the exit pass, I sent out a class-wide email about this, but at the end of week 2 in our in-person session, Microsoft Outlook had a nationwide outage, and so some students received that emailed link and some students did not. When I looked at the response rates, it was very low. So as of the time I'm making the week 3 video, I'm not going to answer questions from the week 2 exit pass. I'm going to wait until more students have the opportunity to respond to that Google form. And so during our in-person session for week 3, that's when I'll go over answers to your exit pass questions. All right, without further ado, we'll hop into some review from week 2. So just as a reminder, week 2, you were expected to have read chapter 2 from the textbook on research methods. And we talked in our in-person class during week 2 about the fact that in the social sciences, and specifically in the field of sociology, we follow the scientific method essentially in a very similar way to the natural sciences, except for the topics and the research questions we're asking are going to be a little bit different, right? But we're still asking a question, we're researching existing sources, we're formulating a hypothesis, we're designing and conducting a study, which typically involves collecting and analyzing data. And then we're drawing conclusions. So we're analyzing that data and we're reporting those results. We talked about how oftentimes the sort of quote unquote gold standard for reporting those results is publishing your findings in a scholarly journal article that's been peer reviewed by other people in your field. And so, for that reason, when you were conducting your research methods assignment for week 2, you had to include at least 2 scholarly journal articles, so peer reviewed scholarly journal articles. You also had to, so the bulk of the assignment was about researching existing sources, finding those scholarly journal articles, and I did a tutorial in class. Sorry, no, your class had to, well, we did go over it in class, but your class also had the YouTube video where I did the demonstration on how to find scholarly journal articles. So you could watch that multiple times if you needed to. And I gave examples through the Sinclair Library website as well as Google Scholar. And so once you found those articles, then you formulated your hypothesis or research question. You thought about how you would design a research project and how you would collect data if you were to continue that project. And then you did your annotated bibliography. Okay. So, if you have any final questions about Chapter 2, the weekly assignment, or sharing your weekly selfie entries on that PowerPoint document that you shared with me on the class Word doc, um, make sure you're following up with me before or after class or coming to my office hours, because my expectation is that we've gone over all this stuff in detail during our first couple of weeks in our in-person sessions. And so if you missed that or you still have questions or need clarification, we're to the point where you should be asking those things during not during our class session. So come prepared before or after class week 3 to ask those questions. All right. Now, one of the things I often do when we cover research methods is I like to share my research projects, data that I've actually collected myself, so you can see what social science research methods in the field of sociology looks like for researchers in the field. We didn't get to that last week, so I thought that it would be a good opportunity to cover that material, especially because I do incorporate my original research into class lecture quite often throughout the semester. And so, for example, you've heard me talk a lot about my master's thesis on physical fights on college campuses, as well as my dissertation research looking at Title IX policy and how it gets implemented on college campuses. And so, what I often do when I share my own original research in an in-person face-to-face class is I'll let students choose which of those 2 topics they want to hear me lecture on. But since this is a virtual lecture, I decided to go with the fighting research because that's the one that I've talked about the most so far this semester. So here are your sort of 2 options, and hopefully in the future we'll get to the Title IX stuff. But if you're interested in that topic and you'd like to learn more about my original research on Title IX and campus sexual assault, you're welcome to email me and ask me for more information on my dissertation research. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share the PowerPoint that goes with this topic, and both of these 2 PowerPoints are available for you to download on our eLearn page if you go to Chapter 3 and all the PowerPoints that align with our Chapter 3 content. Okay, so the title for my master's thesis is Doing Gender, Doing Fights, a qualitative exploration of gender and fighting at party schools. And so this should sound familiar to you. I've talked about how I researched physical fights on college campuses for my thesis. I also talked about the fact that my academic advisor was in the process of finalizing and publishing her book on party schools when I was working on my thesis work. And then the other thing I want to point out here is this phrase here, doing gender in quotation marks. That actually comes from a theory that we will learn more about, that your textbook authors actually write about in our chapter on gender. So this is sort of a sneak preview of upcoming attractions for later on in the semester where we focus on gender in society. And so this is adapted for my students at Sinclair. I've done a version of this lecture a lot of times for different audiences. And I point that out to you because thinking about your audience and making changes to your data or your presentation based off of this particular audience, that's an important thing to consider. The other thing I want to point out before I sort of delve into everything is that one of the other reasons why I like to show examples of my research to my students. So, in addition to sort of taking a hands on approach to teaching about the things you're reading in your textbook, it also demonstrates to you how you might want to curate a PowerPoint slide deck if and when you need to present something for class. So, for example, toward the end of the semester, almost pretty much everyone in the class is going to have a group project. And as a group, you're going to have to present a PowerPoint presentation about your topic. If you've never had to do that before and you're struggling with how to organize your PowerPoint, seeing examples from me and how I organize my PowerPoints is sort of a good starting point. So you can sort of use this as a template when you go to create your PowerPoint for your group project. All right. So, similar to my class PowerPoints, I always like to provide an agenda or an overview of what I'll be talking about when I present my research. That gives your audience an idea of what to expect and usually about how long your presentation will be. And so, here I'll talk about key terms, the significance and why my research is important. I'll go over the previous literature, again, which was the focus of what you all were doing for your week 2 assignment. I'll talk about my methods and the data I collected, the findings I found when I analyzed that data, and then I'll end with my concluding thoughts. So I've talked a little bit already this semester about the fact that one of my sort of soapbox things is that oftentimes sociologists like to use key terms in their research and in their presentations without necessarily defining those things. So I always think it's helpful to define key terms, even if the terms that you're using in your research are terms that aren't super academic in nature. Even if they're terms we use in our everyday lives, having that academic definition for your audience really helps to provide clarification. And so that's true of all the stuff here. I believe I told this class, but one of the things that happened when I piloted this study initially is that I went into another campus, not the one where I actually did my study, and I asked them about fights on college campuses. And I found out the hard way I had to define what I meant by fighting because they thought I was talking about verbal altercations and that type of fighting where you're yelling and you're raising your voice. They didn't know that I meant physical altercations where people are throwing punches and that sort of thing until I spelled it out for them and I defined what I meant. So whenever you're collecting data, whenever you're presenting a research topic, or when you are presenting your group project to your classmates, you always want to define the important terms relevant to your topic, even if you think the majority of the people in your audience are going to know what that term means. And so here I define fighting as a physical attack with an unclear victim or perpetrator. And so that's important because if there's a clear victim and perpetrator, that might be a different type of crime or a different type of act. Another thing that people probably have some inkling of what it means, but just to provide that sort of academic textbook definition of it, is party school. This is where there's a student-regulated culture that often involves extreme drinking and risky behavior, such as petty theft. At the school where I collected data for my master's thesis, students liked to steal road signs. And so the town, the city often would not replace these stolen signs. And it became really difficult to know what street you were on or to give directions using street names because of it. So we saw like petty theft and things like that, vandalism. We saw recreational drug use, things like that. And then there are also other types of schools that we should keep in mind as we compare and contrast what this risky behavior and partying looks like at a party school compared to other types of schools like commuter schools, community colleges, and residential campuses. It's also important to point out that some schools carry multiple identities. So our school, Sinclair Community College, is a community college, but it's also a commuter school. So the majority of students are driving into campus on a regular basis to attend class. The school where I collect the data is a party school. It's also a residential campus, meaning the majority of students live on or near campus. So they're living in dorms, buildings that are owned by the university, or they're living in off-campus housing that is close enough to the university that they're walking to campus. So not a lot of driving in and commuting. Um, The other thing that I want to point out is I mentioned scholarly journal articles and how there's sort of this pivotal scholarly journal article from 1987 that was the first comprehensive examination of um, gender based violence on college campuses. That's sort of where these different typologies came from. It was the first time researchers started identifying and organizing universities and college campuses with these different definitions. All right. And then we also have to think about the gender piece here. So masculinity is the appropriate gender norms that, sort of historically in our society are expected of boys and men. Femininity is the appropriate gender norms for girls and women. And then reputation is the socially constructed markers assigned to individuals, oftentimes by their peers. And so something like reputation is one of those terms where we sort of all have a basic understanding of what that means. So it can be challenging to define the term reputation in scholarly literature, but that's something that's important to do if it's relevant to your topic, like it is for this research project. And then one of the things I learned the hard way again in that pilot study is that it's important to provide examples sometimes of what you mean. And so here I have a YouTube link to a fight between two college women and a fight between two college men that I encourage you to watch on your own time if you are so inclined. Perhaps you have never seen a physical fight between two college students, or you're interested in seeing what those fights look like on the college campus where I collected data. And so when I have students watch these YouTube clips when I present this study in class, one of the things I like to point out is the fact that these fights are happening. One of the fights happens in the parking lot of a big apartment building that's walking distance to campus. Another fight that I'll often show happens on the street and sidewalk in front of frat row. So all the frat houses that are sort of in line together. And the fight that happens on frat row is interesting because literally that street, if I was to walk outside of the building where I taught at for the year I taught at this school, it was that street. It was frat row. And so these fights are happening often in broad daylight in the middle of the day, right by where people are teaching and taking classes. And then the other thing the third fight I often show is a fight between two women, and it happens on the sidewalk outside of the main strip, the main drag, where all of the bars and restaurants for that college town are. So again, it's not campus property, but it's walking distance to the campus. And one of the things students will point out is the nuances and the differences between the fight between the women and the fight between the men. And so one of the things that surprised me when I watched those videos is I sort of expected that if and when college women participate in these physical fights, they probably aren't going to adhere to traditional feminine norms. But in fact, the women in the example video that I show, they're dressed very high femme. They have sparkles and sequins on, mini dress and skirt on. They have their purses and high heels. And so that was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting from people who are sort of breaking with traditional feminine norms by getting into physical altercations, which sort of historically in our society has been coded as something only men and boys are supposed to do. The fight between the men lasts longer than the fight between the women. The onlookers, the bystanders, are more encouraging of the men and the women, which is perhaps why that fight lasts longer. And so there's just some interesting gender dynamics that come into play when you watch these examples. And so that sort of informs how I thought about my research questions, how I thought about the interview questions I used for my focus groups, and how I analyzed the data that I got. The reason why I find this project so interesting, you might think of these physical fights as not that serious because often they don't require medical attention or going to the hospital. They're sort of seen as funny or entertaining by a lot of people involved in these fights and in this sort of partying behavior that happens on college campuses. But it's actually because this behavior is being normalized. It's considered, quote unquote, a normal part of the going out process for college students, even though it can lead to some very serious consequences. Sometimes the young people who get involved in these fights do need medical attention. They do have to go to the hospital. And at least some folks within this particular college campus community did express concern. I found out from a friend of mine who was working for this student run newspaper on campus that there had been a high profile fight recently where one of the guys involved actually was put into a coma. He was in the hospital. A lot of students on campus found out about it, and they wrote into the student newspaper to express concern. They were worried that their peers and their colleagues were getting into these physical fights that were so severe that people were getting harmed. People were having to go to the hospital and seek medical attention. Um, and then the risk of injury is pretty high. So the CCVS is a survey that had already been conducted, and the researchers found that 41% of simple assault results in injury. Now, simple assault likely includes behavior beyond the physical fights I'm talking about, but certainly that probably these types of fights makes up the bulk of those types of simple assault. And so it's important to note that even though college students often have this misconception that these physical fights are entertaining, they're not that serious, the reality is that they can lead to some serious injury, and we should be worried about them. We should better understand these physical fights so that we can perhaps work with students to lower the rates of physical fights on college campuses. And so trying to understand why this high risk and yet normalized behavior is so common on college campuses is really the root of and the significance of this study. All right, literature, party schools. So during this time around 2013, 2014, there were a lot of researchers publishing books and journal articles about this youth subculture on college campuses called party schools, where students were engaging in this risky, often dangerous behavior. A lot of times the media perpetuates this idea of the quote unquote quintessential college experience. If you think about movies as far back as Animal House, students sort of expect when they go to a four-year college or university that they're going to have this fun experience, and they're going to go out and they're going to go to these frat parties or house parties. They're going to go to these bars and clubs on these college campus towns, and they're going to party. Fighting is just one of many risky behaviors within this that previous studies have already identified as a problem within this youth subculture. And so we're talking about fights that occur between two men or two women. So we're not talking about large brawls or something like that, which is also a part of the risky behavior and also common within this context. And we're thinking about how it's normalized and how common it is within this context. And again, this issue had already been identified in previous studies, the fact that this behavior is normalized and common within this context. All right. Continuing on with literature and theory, so doing gender is this idea that gender is in all social interactions. It's in our everyday social interactions on a sort of micro scale, and gender also impacts things on a macro scale, so sort of on that institutional level, but we can't really escape doing gender. We code things as masculine and feminine all the time in our society, and we've already talked about that a little bit, even though this is only week 3. So we've talked about how different majors in higher education are coded as masculine or feminine. Different chores are coded as masculine or feminine, like household chores, like doing the dishes, doing the laundry, or taking out the trash and recycling. These things are socially constructed, so that just means that they're socially agreed upon behaviors, and that term should sound familiar from lecture for the first couple of weeks. Now, there's different ways that we sort of refer to masculinity and femininity within the field of sociology. But the two main things that are important for this study is hegemonic masculinity, which is a socially agreed upon ideal way to perform masculinity. So if you think about masculinity as a hierarchy, the most prized ideal form of masculinity that men are attempting to achieve would be hegemonic masculinity. Now, oftentimes this term gets convoluted with a more pop culture type term, which is toxic masculinity. And certainly when men try to achieve hegemonic masculinity, it can lead to them engaging in toxic masculinity, so problematic behavior often rooted in violence. And I would argue that getting into these physical fights is part of that culture. But for our purposes, hegemonic masculinity is the more academic term that we would use. And then emphasized femininity is sort of similar, but for women. And this is a socially agreed upon ideal way to perform femininity. Again, if you think about femininity as being on a hierarchy, The top of that hierarchy, the most prized form of femininity, sort of high fem, if you will, would be emphasized femininity, what many women are trying to achieve by adhering to beauty standards and that sort of thing. Certainly, the majority of college women are looking to adhere to emphasize femininity. The women in the example video that I showed you or that I mentioned earlier are definitely adhering to, are trying to achieve emphasize femininity by wearing high femme clothing and having their makeup and hair done and that sort of thing. All right. Research methods, what we really should be focusing on as we finalize and follow up with week 2 content. So I did 3 focus groups with 14 participants total at a large North Central university from December 2013 to February 2014. They lasted approximately 2 hours. Here's the gender makeup of my focus groups compared to the overall population. Again, another key term from our chapter on research methods that should sound familiar to you. You can see the age of my sample versus the age of the overall population, and you can see the race as well. Now, there's some discrepancies between my sample and my population. It's likely that because fighting often gets coded as masculine, when I recruited participants in classes, men were more likely to want to participate or feel competent and confident in talking about fighting. And then the age was a little bit younger, probably because I recruited in lower division classes where students are more likely to be freshmen and sophomores who are, 18 to 20. The race is also a little bit off. It's disproportionately people of color in my sample compared to the overall population. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but one thought is that at the time when I collected data at this university, it was very, 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 very predominantly white, even more so than many colleges and universities across the country. So that sort of changed rapidly. And so because I was and there's more diversity at that school now. And so since I was recruiting from lower division underclassmen, perhaps we were already starting to see more diversity at that school, and it just wasn't reflected in the overall population statistics I had access to at that time. All right. So that's sort of one way that you could present your research methods. If you're presenting original research to an audience, especially an audience full of academics, they often want to see this type of stuff related to your research methods, and they'll probably ask you questions at the end about that. I also like to provide sample questions so people know and get a sense and a flavor for how you were talking to your participants. And so I asked participants in my focus groups questions about how common different types of fights were. I asked them to describe any fights that they had witnessed or had heard about on campus. And then I was also interested in looking at what happens before and after the fight, because these fights are short. Like if you watch those example fights, even though the one between the 2 men is a little bit longer than the one between the 2 women, they're still not super long. I mean, this isn't like, cage fighting and UFC and stuff like that where we have trained professionals. These are amateur fights, right? And then I also asked questions about how and if these fights and getting into these fights contributes to the fight participants' individual identity. Findings. So you always want to organize your findings, often in scholarly journal articles, and I hope that this was true for the ones that you used for your week 2 assignment and your annotated bibliography. People tend to choose 3 main findings that they go into greater detail about, and if they had other findings when they were analyzing their data, typically that's too much for one journal article, and so they'll publish additional findings in other journal articles or in a book, something a little bit more substantial. For my purposes here, I organize things into 2 different types of findings based off of findings for men and findings for women. And so what I found is that college men fight to, or at least they're perceived by their peers, because the participants in my study did not need to have been in a physical fight in order to be a participant. They just had to be willing to talk about their perceptions of other college students who get into fights. And so the perception of the participants was that college men fight to prove their masculinity and to perform appropriate masculine norms. However, there was an exception. So if men were getting into these physical fights, but they were losing the fight and they were showing emotion, then perhaps that would not be a good way to prove masculinity and sort of perform appropriate masculine norms, because part of masculinity involves being successful in these fights. Showing emotion, especially certain types of emotion that are associated with losing a fight, that's coded feminine or at least not masculine. And so you also always want to present some of your data to your audience. And so this is actual transcripts from the focus group interviews I conducted. So one man in one of the focus groups said, if you're known as a guy that wins fights, like my roommate's been in 5 or 6 fights now, he's won every one, and he's known as, in the frat, he's known as a super cool guy, and oh, he's a fighter and he's really big and tough. And so that gives you a sense of how college students are actually talking about this issue. And then another participant said, yeah, I think if you're connected to thinking like you're a big tough caveman, then yeah, fighting would have, like you said, it's connected to masculinity. You need to be manly. I bet if you lose a fight, I bet that would really hurt emotionally. And so you can see how people are talking about men who get into these fights and then they lose. Another thing I'll point out that's more of a logistical thing is that you want to, when you're presenting interview data, you want to include some information about the people who are talking, some contextual factors. So you want to, especially if the focus of your research is gender, you want to include the gender of that person, their age. You want to either give them their participant number, or sometimes you might come up with a fake name for them. It's really up to you. You're allowed to make some stylistic choices when you present your findings and your original data to your audience, but people are going to want to know certain things about your participants, especially if you're presenting direct quotes from that person. And then I also have findings about women. So women are also fighting to demonstrate appropriate feminine norms. In fact, they often had to justify and explain their participation in these physical fights because it's not seen as this sort of historical way to do femininity. So women often talked about how the women that they've seen get into these physical fights, they had been verbally insulted by the person they got into the fight with beforehand. They had some sort of prolonged tension, perhaps, negative comments exchanged on social media platforms and things like that. And then after the fight, it continues. And so they have to explain and justify why they got into that fight after the fact. Versus men really didn't have to do these things. They could get into a fight for any reason or no reason at all, and they didn't have to explain why they got into that fight afterwards in the same way that their female counterparts did. The exception here was what people referred to as the ratchet woman. So if a woman self-identified as quote unquote being ratchet or quote unquote not very classy, then she maybe didn't do all of these things. But the majority of the women that these participants had seen get into these physical fights, they had to explain and justify their participation because it isn't this traditional feminine thing. And they were also getting into these fights in very feminine ways. I would also argue that these things like verbally assaulting someone and sort of getting into some sort of like verbal altercation beforehand, that's coded as much more feminine than getting into a physical fight, which is coded as masculine. And so here are some examples here. A feminine trait is to be more passive. And I feel like a lot of female fights, they had been personally attacked verbally beforehand, such as, oh, she called me a bitch. Well, I can't have people thinking that it's okay for her to call me a bitch, or I need to do something about this. And again, I present details about who's talking when I give that transcript. And then another participant said, the way I look at fighting with women is I just don't think it's very reputable. I just don't think it's a very classy thing. But I know some girls that will. I know this one girl who will label herself as ratchet. That's part of her identity, and she's proud of it. She would be more proud to get in a fight than I would. And so by concluding thoughts, which you always want to provide after you go into greater detail about your findings, traditional notions of gender norms persist. Even when people are breaking away from gender norms, they have to somehow get back to traditional gender norms. But there are some exceptions. And so I wonder if there are exceptions or alternative forms of masculinity and femininity available to college students. Does that mean, as far as like if you think about the developmental process and the fact that oftentimes traditional college age students aren't seen as quote unquote real adults, they're still quote unquote finding themselves, right? Like that's how we as a society tend to refer to young people in college. Maybe they're allowed to explore their masculinity and femininity during that part of their lives in ways that you're not allowed to before and after being a traditional college age student and being a college student on some of these party school campuses. But I wonder if this is something unique to party schools, like because something about these youth subcultures where students are already engaging in risky behavior gives them permission to explore their masculinity and femininity and alternative ways of sort of performing masculinity and femininity in a way that maybe isn't available to students at school, other types of schools, like community colleges, for example. Ultimately, in order to explore that question further, I would need to conduct additional research at other types of college campuses, which I decided not to do. Studying, fighting, after doing that for about 2 years, I just couldn't fathom continuing a project on this topic. But I think it would be interesting to learn more about that in the future. And that's often typical of the research process. So you set out with, a handful of research questions, but definitely at least one. You collect data or you analyze secondary data to answer those research questions. And then you come up with findings that attempt to answer some of those research questions. But the research process is rarely over and done with after that. As you answer the initial questions you had, it leads to more questions like what I have here. And so you continue collecting data and you continue the research process to answer the new questions that come up as you continue to answer your initial questions. And then, of course, you want to provide your works cited page. And so you can see here, I had you focus on scholarly journal articles for your week 2 assignment and your annotated bibliography because that's sort of the gold standard in research. But here I have a lot of books. I also had to cite Urban Dictionary because it was the only way I could get a definition for the term ratchet, I believe. And then here you can see that this is a pivotal study on the concept of doing gender, which is now a sort of classic gender theory within the field of sociology. And even though, so here's the title. We know it's the title because it's italicized. It's the title of the journal. Even though the journal doesn't have, or sorry, yeah, even though the journal doesn't have the word journal in the title, the name of the journal is Gender and Society. We know from my citation list that this is a journal because it's we have the volume and the journal number here as well as the page numbers for that particular article, because in a journal there's going to be multiple journal articles published all together. And so I talked about that when I did my demonstrations last week, but this just sort of shows you what that looks like. And then I always like to thank my audience for listening, and then they can sort of ask questions. So that's just one example of what research can look like. As we come to an end for your virtual lecture for week 3, selfie entry 3 item. I'm not going to give it to you if you're listening to the virtual lecture. You have to be in person for week 3 in order to get that item. Remember, if you're sick or have to miss class because of a transportation emergency or anything like that, email me before our class starts on Thursday evening and I will respond. It might not be until after our class is over, but I will respond eventually with the selfie entry 3 item. If you don't email me or you email me after class has started, I won't give you the selfie item, and so you'll lose 1 point for that selfie entry. I'm trying to incentivize people who show up and attend class regularly, as well as those folks who are emailing me and communicating me following the processes and policies from the syllabus. And the syllabus says you're supposed to contact me before class starts. So make sure you're doing all of that. I will see you in person. Don't forget to fill out the exit pass for week 3 after class, our in-person session. Finish reading chapters 3 and 4. Start reading chapters 5 and 6. Add selfie entry 3 to your selfie log. Make sure you're keeping up with that. Submit reading quiz 1 on eLearn by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure you're keeping up with the virtual work. Remember, half our class is online, half is in person, and you need to do both in order to be successful and earn a good grade in our class. Have a great weekend. Email me if you have any follow-up questions. I hope to see you in person Thursday evening.